How's it going, everybody? This is somewhat of an intro to the intro because the other day I had the amazing opportunity to record a conversation interview hybrid thing with none other than Adam Nolly Getgood. And I got to ask him all the questions I had and also ask him a bunch of questions that you guys in the community had. And we talked about everything from vintage 30s, other speakers, cabinets, amplifiers, pickups, modifications, production techniques, all the way to just being old by the end of it. The whole conversation was great for me. It lasted well over 2 hours, and I did my best to edit it down, but still I landed at just under 2 hours because, quite frankly, I think pretty much everything Nolly has to say is worth hearing. Still, I did my best to signpost the conversation a bit with some timestamps in the description below for the topics roughly, because I understand not everybody has 2 hours to kill at once, so you may want to use that as navigation aid or to pick up later if you want to listen to this in different intervals. I hope you enjoyed this conversation as much as I did. Yeah, let's get into it. Hi everybody, I'm here today with somebody who I greatly admire with lots of credentials as a producer, engineer, accomplished musician, entrepreneur, and for some reason he's chosen to spend his time talking to me. I present to you Adam Getgood, aka Nolly. How you doing?
I'm doing really well, thanks, John. That was a lovely introduction. And if I can return the lovely introduction, I just want to say I've really enjoyed all the content that you've been putting out. It's been so cool to see someone with serious kind of scientific chops, as it were, and an idea of how to test things in a fair way, actually kind of pick up the ball from my very haphazard and unplanned testing of speakers and kind of codify stuff and come up with some really, really good outcomes as well. And it also edifies my ego a little bit that you seem to have confirmed a lot of what I found as well. So on top of that, you're a great communicator, and I'm just really looking forward to having a chat with someone that and also kind of putting information out there to a community around you that seems very interested in the really nerdy, geeky stuff about speakers.
Well, thank you very much. That means a lot. That means a lot to me coming from you, especially since I think you were a fantastic communicator, and I enjoyed watching the interview on Christian Kohler's channel a lot, which kind of put me or helped me in my testing, because you brought up certain aspects that I really didn't have on my radar before that. And yeah, I mean, we might as well get into it, because I believe there's something you want to set the record straight on, because apparently every vintage 30 made after 2003 is garbage, or at least those are words that some people are trying to put into your mouth.
Yeah, so it's interesting. I think people maybe, especially if they just listen to certain parts of that podcast with Christian or places that I've spoken about speakers elsewhere, might have got the impression that I was kind of trying to say that the only speakers worth using and the only ones I would touch with a barge pole are those ones which we kind of colloquially called the golden age, the golden period of vintage 30s. And I think that some people maybe got slightly the wrong impression and got the idea that perhaps I'm a little bit less tolerant than I actually am when it comes to that kind of stuff. Because, you do see comments, people kind of being a bit snarky, being like, oh, all my 2007 V30 that I've used on X record and everyone loved the guitar tone is obviously rubbish now that I've heard Nolly saying that or whatever. And yeah, I think that the point that I wanted to clarify, and I think I actually said in the original interview, is that most eras of vintage 30s, if you can find one that's got a relatively soft amount of high-end fizz, as you brought up in your videos, that kind of 5 to 6K region, it's probably going to be able to do something pretty cool in the right enclosure. But what was going on for me was that there were these tones that I was hearing on records, and I was talking to the people that were making the records or had made the records, and they were talking about how those tones really didn't involve very much EQ, and I just simply wasn't able to match that sound. And that was a sound that I loved. And that led me down the path down towards those speakers from the early 2000s that, I do think they have a certain special something. I think for high gain tones, it's very hard to beat those ones because of that kind of soft fizz on the top. But I really just, want to make sure that the point's reinforced that in no way does it mean that there aren't like perfectly great tones that can be achieved with vintage 30s or other speakers from any other era either.
No, I definitely agree. I very much like the vintage 30 tones that I had with my own gear before that, and I was quite far into my own vintage 30 quest until I really actually played with those early 2000 vintage 30s, because I collected these speakers for several years, and I purposely didn't start testing them before I had a suitable amount together because I knew it was going to be a slightly painful process. And if I would have to do it several times, I probably wouldn't want to do it anymore. So it took me a while until I really listened to those early 2000 speakers as well. And I think a clear pattern really emerged that 5 to 6 kilohertz region seems to be really critical for those, and that really smooths out the sounds, a very pleasant tone. And as you brought up with your interview, or in your interview with Christian Kohle, that was really an era-defining sound in that early metalcore music as well, which I grew up with for the most part.
I think because of the records that came out in that era, and then the influence that those records had on the sounds of records that came out in more recent times, I feel like, yeah, they really do have a kind of definitive sound to them. And I think for me, it was the chase of trying to get that tone and then finally finding the pattern and the era where they came out that was so exciting, and wanting to share that information to other people because no one was really talking about it in those terms. The debate mostly revolved around like Chinese versus UK vintage 30s. And I think people had the impression that there were like these really vast differences in terms of like quality of the speakers, or that there was some kind of changes being snuck into the design, and nothing quite added up until the kind of looking at the date codes and understanding a bit more about the manufacturing process kind of came to light.
That's really the aspect that triggered me into my vintage 30 journey, because coming from an engineering background, the explanations that Celestion delivered, meaning those are the same machines, same parts, same processes, and I figured if everything is the same except the location, there can't be a huge difference between them. And there still is a lot of hearsay about the Celestion vintage 30s and Chinese manufacturing of them, in particular on forums and on Facebook. And that just bothered me, because depending on who you asked, you got a completely different answer. And even the tests that were out there at the time, while I believe they had the best intentions, they weren't always methodologically sound. As you pointed out yourself, sometimes people were comparing 8 ohm speakers with 16 ohm speakers in different cabs, and that's just too many parameters that they're in that have potentially quite a significant influence on the tone generated. And that just annoyed me. That's the reason really why I started trying to reveal the secret of the vintage 30. What's the deal? I wanted to know the truth about it.
And you'd started that before the conversation with Christian, right? Like you'd started collecting the speakers before all of that.
Yeah,
right?
about 5-6 years ago, I started that, and I don't know, I just got a few speakers and I figured I'd do that. And then I realized I'd bitten off a lot more than I can chew, because then I started researching the vintage 30 and realized there's about 10 or 11 different models out there. There's the Mesa Boogie OEMs, the Marshall OEMs. They come in 8 and 16 ohms, and I figured they would sound different. I didn't know if I knew it back then. I can't remember, but they had different type codes, so they had to be considered. Then I realized there was a Bad Cat OEM. Then there were these Hughes and Kettner 1777 cone ones, those allegedly Mesa black frame ones that I, in the meantime, don't really think have anything to do with Mesa Boogie at all. And if they did, they definitely weren't exclusive to Mesa Boogie, because I still haven't seen a Mesa Boogie cab with black frame speakers. On the other hand, I have seen quite a few Hughes and Kettner cabs from the early 90s that have them, some Johnson cabs and combos that had them. And I even saw an early Engel cab that didn't have the metal grill, but grill cloth in front of that also had black frame 8 ohm speakers, though it's hard to say if those were stock in that cab, but they definitely weren't exclusive to Mesa Boogie. And the 16 ohm black frame, that still eludes me. I think that's the only one I haven't been able to track down yet. And I have no idea where they came from. Seems like some 90s Ampeg guitar cabs had them. Maybe I saw one reverb listing where they were in a high watt cab, but impossible to say if that was the stock configuration. I can't find anything about them, and nobody seems to know what's up with the black frame speakers. And the 2 8 ohm black frame speakers I had in my test, apart from the early 2000 speakers, were one of the few ones that were noticeably different to the rest. They were a lot more efficient and were much louder than the other ones. And that could have been coincidence. They might have been right at that ideal point of break-in where the speaker appears to get more efficient, as it was in my test, before it starts falling off again, possibly. That's just speculation on my part. Maybe there's something different with them. I think I asked you if you knew anything about the black frame speakers a while back.
I've never had one actually. So the thing, I mean, I think you understand because of your line of work. I think there's a few things that people coming at these things from the angle of sound don't necessarily immediately think about, or don't understand the impact of, which would be like tolerances and how an engineer might specify a speaker versus a musician. And like, you know, I feel like there's a lot of this kind of miscommunication and misunderstanding happens around those two things. Like the fact that you could have from one production batch, it could be separated off into different levels of tolerance and sold to different companies. Or, you know, I know, for example, Mesa Boogie demand a tighter tolerance, and that's one of the reasons why they have their T number different and have different sorting. They pay more for them, and then they can claim that they're superior. But it's not that, like, you know, the tone gremlins are putting extra tone juice on those ones as they go out the door to Mesa Boogie. It's just like sorting. Just like when you go to the nice supermarket, they've got weirdly the nicest, freshest cherries and the strawberries, and it's not that they've got this one farm that only makes the best strawberries and cherries. It's that they get like the premium selection, and then, you know, depending on how much the suppliers want to spend on buying the product, they get different levels of quality. So, you know, tolerance is such a huge aspect, especially with something like a paper cone, which in many ways is quite analogous to like an organic, like fruit or vegetable, you know, something like that, where there is just going to be like quite a lot of natural variation, and that can have quite an unpredictable effect on the end tone. And then, yeah, like the different T numbers and the way that things would have to be done within a factory setting in order to keep production lines separate could be for really minor or very minor aesthetic reasons. But reading into that as an end user, you can get completely the wrong idea that there's, you know, a totally different production line with the amazing machines that they reserve only for those speakers, or whatever people imagine's going on. You know, often I think Occam's razor applies in these situations.
Yes, fire up the special machine. Mesa Boogie have ordered a batch of speakers. Yeah, no, that I agree with you. That makes a lot of sense. And I think also a lot of these different T numbers might just be different labels as well, because from a production standpoint, you'd want to be able to differentiate them. You'd give them a different article number in your ERP system to process your orders properly, stuff like that. And that speaker, well, the Vintage 30 goes back 86, so almost 40 years now. And probably a lot of that knowledge is lost, wasn't documented properly because it wasn't needed. And then again, maybe some of the mystique, the mystery is in the best interest of some of these players. I'm not sure if, and I'm speculating here, if Mesa Boogie would, if it would be in their interest to come out and to say speakers are essentially the same as the stock ones, just with a tighter tolerance band. Oh, sure. Yeah. I think like the OEM, I think the manufacturers that are receiving these OEM speakers, it's in their best interest to make it sound like they are somehow extra special, have something that's drastically different. And I think you're right that a lot of stuff's got lost along the way. So I think I alluded in the interview with Christian that like I have had some people that are kind of quite in on this stuff tell me things which I really, out of interest for their, protecting their jobs in a way, really, because they wouldn't necessarily want this information to get out. Like they have told me certain things about what might have gone on during manufacturing, the things that they might have had to alter in order to get around certain manufacturing difficulties or changes in legislations and things like that, which none of which was come out from like a sound perspective. You know what I mean? Like Celestion didn't choose to change the sound of the Vintage 30. There's just over 40 years, manufacturing standards and practices and regulations have changed a lot. And a company, there is this, and I really want to not throw anyone under the bus here, so I'll be careful in choosing my words, that you're talking about two companies. You're talking about Kurt Moeller and you're talking about Celestion, and they don't necessarily have perfect communication between them, is the point I'm trying to make. So there'll be certain things that are only realized over time on Celestion's end, perhaps, as something's changed in the manufacturing process to meet a certain regulation or optimize a certain process. And it might take a really long time for those things to be noticed really by end users.
And meanwhile, nothing's actually drifted out of spec with the speaker. So again, I just want to make the point that I think a lot of the changes that came about are not voicing changes. They're changes with remarkably tiny aspects of the design, because we've got such a sensitive system, right? It's almost a chaotic system, I think, a speaker. Like the tiniest difference in this pulp length distribution and all that stuff is going to create different resonance patterns. It's wild.
Especially with the cones being made of cellulose paper, effectively. I believe it's probably extremely hard to control those parameters, and you can see it in the different frequency response graphs. You know, the higher the frequency goes, the more they kind of diverge, and it makes kind of sense. I can't imagine being able to manufacture paper that reacts consistently up there at 10 kilohertz. And I believe that's probably the reason why most speaker frequency responses are actually specified between, I don't know, 50 or 80 to 5,000 hertz.
Yeah.
Speaking of cones, I think in one of the other videos you brought up that Kurt Müller, they make high-tech audio cones like carbon fiber cones, plastic cones. Why do you think that we haven't really seen anything like that in guitar speakers yet? Is there a particular reason? Is it just because guitarists react poorly to change usually, or do they just not sound as good?
I mean, I think the problem is the sound of electric guitar is kind of this creation which came out of the marriage of like the guitar, the technology, the pickups, the amplification, and the speakers, and that's the voice of the electric guitar. And you see it with pickups too. You know, when companies come out with like an improved pickup in terms of frequency response or something, guitarists just tend to react weirdly, because in some way it's like a fundamental change to the DNA of the instrument. So, and I think much more so with guitar than with bass, you get a lot of pushback, which is, you know, guitarists are always looking for the next thing. But the problem is if the manufacturer comes out with the next thing that's actually like a leap forwards in terms of materials or frequency response, so then the guitarists just go, well, this doesn't sound like a guitar anymore. I mean, obviously you see FR speakers now, and I think those, you know, people are kind of pushing basically like modern speaker designs into kind of guitar cabinet shaped things. But the whole thing is a weird, you know, like a closed speaker cabinet. You've basically got like a tiny room behind your speaker that's having this massive internal comb filtering and bass resonance building effect on the sound. It's such a like inadvertently complicated setup, I think, that so, you know, such a huge part of the sound of electric guitar that we all know and love, that it's just you can't really improve it, right? It would be like saying, well, Bolognese has been around for a long time, we should make it better. We should and I mean, as a chef, sure, you can refine the quantities and the quality of the raw materials, but like ultimately it stops being a Bolognese if you kind of chuck entirely new ingredients in there.
That's true. At the same time, hemp cones seem to be, you know, at least a niche thing in the meantime. I have a friend send me his Tone Tubby speaker I need to try out still. And neodynium magnets seem to be slowly moving into the guitar speaker world with Celestion with their Neo Greenback, which I also like quite a bit. And Jensen have a few cool neodynium speakers I hope to try one day. So yeah, things are moving. So I don't know, maybe we'll see different co-materials one day as well. If
maybe, yeah. I mean, I guess if you can create the sound like a paper cone without making it out of paper, which, let's be honest, is paper. There's a lot of glue involved as well. It's not a very environmentally beautiful thing.
No.
The paper cone that we end up with is not a very natural material. So if something that's more environmentally friendly can be created, then I think that could be marketable. But it has to sound like what people are used to, otherwise they're not going to jump on it. And you can't tell guitarists that something sounds better than the paper cone, really. Like, it's not a question of that anymore. People have already formed their idea of what a good guitar tone is, and you can't really come along and say, well, this is better. In fact, actually, so my involvement with Celestion came about probably 10 years ago or so. Someone reached out to me in my days playing with Periphery, and they were like, you know, you guys are playing really low, distorted music. Is there something that you're looking for in a speaker that we don't currently make? And I think I kind of frustrated them over this conversation that was sporadically taking place over a couple of years of like, well, frankly, the vintage 30s it. They were like, well, do you want like more high end, more low end? And it's kind of like, I don't want more high end. And the low end's really more to do with the cabinet enclosure anyway, because we're playing closed back speakers. And you speak to these engineers and they're talking about the sound of the speakers recorded in free air at 2 meters or whatever their test scenario is. Like, that's the frequency response they're looking at. It doesn't necessarily translate to what, you know, as a metal guitarist producer, I'm doing with like an SM57 up against that grill in a closed back cab. And I mean, that's the whole other part of it, right? It's the microphone in front of the speaker as well. And that interplay of capturing actually a really quite a small, or, you know, prioritizing a very small amount of that speaker from a very close range is another key part of the kind of modern metal sound.
Yes, lots of parameters, mic placement, especially on which side of the speaker. As you also discovered, the glue blobs make a difference. Yeah. And I did that test in my ISO cab. I just rotated the speakers 90 degrees and made some frequency response graphs. I don't think I put that in a video, but can confirm that changes the sound.
I mean, it would be just mind-blowing physics if it didn't, right? Like, you're dampening the cone with actually like a rubbery kind of glue material. Like, it would defy the laws of physics, I think, if it didn't dampen the frequency response a bit. But again, you talk to the engineers, they're recording from, I think it's a meter back. I don't know what they're like. The standard test measuring thing is like speaker hanging in midair out of an enclosure, recorded from far enough back that difference doesn't really matter. You know, you're not hearing it in that resolution, but when you're a few centimeters away from it, of course, it becomes quite a major component of the sound.
It's interesting that they tested so far removed from the final application, because, you know, nobody uses guitar speakers like that in the real world. But then that opens the question, what cabs do you test the speakers in? That's because that's a huge factor as well.
Yeah, and that, again, their engineers, they're testing for consistency. They're testing really more than anything. They have a tolerance of frequency response, and they're checking for like actual problems, like, are the speakers failing in some ways? That is, you know, has something happened which is now a failed speaker. As far as it comes with tones, I think they will sort. This is actually something to do with tolerances as well. I think they do sort to an extent. Like, these batches have more frequency response, more high frequency response. Marshall has a preference for those speakers, so those will be, you know, given to Marshall. And Orange has a preference for dark speakers. I know both those statements to be true. Like, the batches, when they're sorted, if there's particularly dark ones and Orange is placing an order, those will be preferentially supplied to Orange, for example. So again, the tolerances come into play. But yeah, you know, these guys are often not testing them playing like chugging metal either, high gain tones. Like, they're playing with like the distorted sounds they might test with in a production testing scenario, if they at all test the sound with a kind of guitar signal, are going to be like kind of blues rocky kind of playing stuff, which doesn't really represent the level of scrutiny that the speaker comes under when you're chucking a high gain amp, you know, chugging through it in a closed back cab.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And I guess one final point to make as well, actually, sorry to talk over you, is the vintage 30 is still the best selling speaker in the world. So like, from their perspective as a large company, they're like, you know, as much as there's this group of really nerdy metal guys that are saying, oh, they were so good 20 years ago, they're kind of like, well, we're still selling more of these than any other speaker, and no one apart from you cares. So
oh yeah, I mean, it's an industry standard for a reason, and even the non-2000 to 2003 speakers sound fantastic. I fell in love with the vintage 30 the first time I heard it, I think 12 years ago at this point. And but you say things like, it's obvious, like there's glue, there's rubber on that part that has to affect the tone, but that really, you have to look at the speakers to really realize that. And at least it took me, I think, almost 10 years in my journey as a casual guitar player to even pay attention to the speakers and the speaker cabinets. And it was one gig I had with my band at the time in our local venue. There was a touring band from England coming through. They were loads of fun, and they had an orange cab that I got to use that evening. And that was really the moment where I realized, oh crap, not all cabs are the same. It is the speakers. There's a difference, because for some reason the thought had never occurred to me that the speakers and the cabinets make a difference. Because, as you said earlier, the enclosure makes a huge difference, and maybe from a pure technically audio standpoint, that's kind of backwards. When I guess when with hi-fi speakers and monitors, stuff like that, you want them to sound as neutral as possible. So that had never occurred to me. Yeah. And with that in mind, do you think that in recent past, attention has moved more to speakers and cabinets than before, or because I'm not sure. My view is, of course, biased. This is something I'm occupying with myself a lot these days, so I'm not really sure. But the impression I get is that people are giving speakers and cabinets the attention they deserve more in the meantime.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And I think digital modeling had a huge part to play in that, because for people to, even on the older pods and whatever, to have like switchable amps and cabs, when you start switching the cabs and you're like, wow, this has drastically changed the sound, it immediately points to something that maybe you weren't contemplating before. And it makes sense too that the cabs are typically these dark, like opaque visually, and just, in terms of like getting an understanding of what's going on inside them is like very difficult to see from the front. They're very passive, again, both, electronically and in terms of your interaction with them. It's just like, you just plug your amp in and that's the bit you're twiddling and adjusting the volume in guitar. It's just like that thing that's just blowing the air around your feet, and until you start putting microphones on them, they don't really, a lot of these things don't become evident. And actually, to go back to the very first thing we were talking about, where maybe people are mischaracterizing how much I care about speakers being from the early 2000s. I will say, like, it's totally situation dependent. Like, if I'm just playing through a cab, I don't care. Like it's not like listening to the cab in person, it barely matters, unless it's like a T75 cab or something that's very evidently kind of bright and metallic sounding. Like, most cabs with vintage 30s or greenbacks in sound fine to jam through in the room. And then, if I was recording a demo, I wouldn't care. But if it comes to like, okay, now you're doing a record and it's a band that, you want to do the best for the band, it's like, you're entering a cooking competition and you have to serve the best possible steak. So of course you're going to go and like find where the best beef comes. Sorry, vegans. You're going to find where the best beef comes from, and get the cut of steak and probably kind of look at all the individual steaks to find the one with just the right marbling for the presentation you're going to give. It's like you're putting this tone on a plate, and it in that situation it serves to go down those rabbit holes. And sorry, I'm going on another monologue here, but the thing which I've noticed, which is curious, is that you can, once you stop searching for excellence in that realm, it's amazing how all the tiny things that seemingly are very small on their own, once you start being like, well, that's a really tiny thing, we don't need to worry too much about that. It's weird. You suddenly cross this threshold and suddenly it becomes rubbish. And you're like, how did we cross such a distance from excellent to now rubbish with these really tiny changes? What I'm trying to express is there's certain situations where you really need to be critical and going for excellence, and that's the only way to get that quality of end product consistently.
So the cumulative effect of all these small things in a recording and production situation, that's when you really need to focus on these kind of things. And in the moment when you're playing with the band or practicing, as I got it, you're absolutely not a cork sniffer. You're not going to start chugging, ugh, what is this cab? This is not a vintage 30. Get this out of my sight.
Exactly, yeah.
The right tools for the right situation, basically.
Yeah, and I guess in the situation of a recording, you are trying to find that balance between micromanaging and kind of going too far down the rabbit hole for time reasons, for patience, for focus, for, sanity. And you're trying to balance that against trying to get a really good outcome. And I guess what I was expressing in a very long-winded way is it's just weird how quickly you can end up actually with a bad outcome from just being like, oh yeah, well, it's close enough, that's fine. And then like, yeah, a few decisions like that, and suddenly you're not producing something that's world-class anymore.
Devil's in the details. So a lot of people ask me, and I'm just going to throw in some user questions here, or viewer questions, when they kind of fit the situation. A lot of people ask me, which is your favorite vintage 30? Do you have a favorite vintage 30, or do you have a few favorite vintage 30s?
Yeah, so I think the cab that stood the test of time for me is it's a Mesa Boogie cab with speakers from early 2000. I think they're from February 2000. And I've had I think I had 4 or 5 cabs from that kind of era. And I discovered those ones just before I discovered these really dark speakers that came out in 2001. And I loved those so much when I first found them, because there was such a big difference. It was such a noticeable difference when you went to one of those, and they are so smooth. And I do really like those cabs still, don't get me wrong. They're probably not my second favorite. But then over time, the ones which I keep coming back to were the ones from 2000. There's one particular one that I was mentioning in the start of the answer, which, you know, realistically, if I get called to do a guitar recording session for some kind of distorted tone, I'm going to take a cab, because I'm not going to take 5 cabs in my car. I'm going to choose one cab, right? That's probably going to be the one that I choose, because those ones from 2001s are so dark, but you're kind of starting from a place of like, you can't really get it bright, because even dead center mic position with a fairly bright mic is still dark. So the 2000 has that really nice smooth top end character to it. It can get edgier and more aggressive if you work it with the microphone, by which I mean just going closer to the center. And it's more like when you mic in the default position on the cap edge, it's just going to sound brilliant. And all 4 speakers in that cab sound really good too. So there's that. And then I think the other cab, which I come back to, is my Zilla 412, which I got in 2012, which had 2012 Chinese vintage 30s. It actually had a 2 and 2 lynchbacks in an X pattern.
I'd love to try lynchbacks.
Yeah, I should send you one. In fact, I think I sent you a picture of one of those lynchbacks, which I left on like a packing sheet for like 1 second, and when I picked it up, it was just completely bearded and covered in fluff. It was very depressing.
Oh, that was a lynchback. I didn't realize
that was a lynchback. Yeah, oh. Yeah, that was one of those, one of the 2 lynchbacks I had.
Oh, gee, that makes it extra painful. Yeah. Well, thanks for offering. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, no, I'd be very happy to kind of contribute that. And that cab, yeah, so Chinese made vintage 30s from 2012, and it was funny because I'd mic up that cab and I'd compare it to the Mesa Boogie vintage 30 recordings. I'd be like, why doesn't this sound like that? So I kind of discarded it, or it wasn't what I was trying to use all the time. I was always trying to chase this other sound. And then once I found the sound that I liked in the Mesa Boogie cabs, I went back to miking up that Zilla, and I was like, oh, this one's really good too. Like, it's weird how I kind of just needed to figure out what was going on with that other sound in order to be able to appreciate what I had all along. So there you go, 2012 Chinese vintage 30s. I think that's a really, really lovely sounding cab as well.
I think that's also in I think the behind the scenes video for your Neural DSP plugin. I think you're sitting on the floor there with probably an open Mesa cab. The way the speaker is oriented, at least it looks like a Mesa cab, and the black and white Zilla cab opened up, and you can see the anniversary label on that.
Good eye, yeah. That would be the one. And that cab, we're talking about speakers exclusively here, but that cab has, it's a very nice kind of Goldilocks cab, because Zilla do an oversized cab which is considerably taller and a little bit wider. It's probably comparable to like an oversized Mesa straight. And then they do one which is more like a traditional Marshall 1960B, kind of almost square. I think it is square sized. And mine is actually kind of an in-between. I don't know why. It's from the earlier days of Zilla when they were all kind of one-off. And so it's really nice because it's kind of, it's just in between those 2 dimensions. And it's got the slightly slanted baffle that you find in a Marshall B cab, which does make quite a big difference actually when you compare it to the ones which are completely straight.
Yeah, I think we spoke about that via email a few months ago about how the frequency response is different in a straight Marshall cab. I finally got a straight Marshall cab the other week, so I'll be doing some testing there to see how much different they sound. I generally want to go into more details on cabs, how they affect the sound. I have a few ideas there, so new rabbit hole for me. And Zilla cabs, I like Zilla cabs a lot. The only 2x12 I kept, except for a Harley Benton one that's more decorative than anything else, is a Zilla Fatboy front-loaded one. Yeah. So I think it was one of the first ones with the new logo. There's something quite special
about those cabs. There's something quite special about them. I've had quite a few 212s because with all the IRs I've made for Neural and for GGD, I've tried most of what's out there, and I don't actually know what it is about the Fatboy that's different, but they all tend to have quite a smooth top end, and I don't usually think about the cabinet affecting the high end as much. You know what I mean? I tend to think of the speaker as being the main thing that defines that. But having recorded many Fatboys, they do actually sound quite naturally smooth. Yeah. We actually did a big shootout for Zilla. I expect those videos are going to come out fairly soon where we did, I forget however many.
Yes, Zilla.
Different.
They're back on YouTube, which I'm happy to see.
Yes, they're back on YouTube. Yeah. And we did, like a really deep shootout for metal tones with a bunch of Fatboys and different speakers, including actually my 2000 vintage 30 that I was referring to just now. we actually took a pair of them out of that Mesa cab and put them in a Zilla Fatboy to have as a reference. And I do really like that enclosure, actually. And it sounds very different, like a Mesa Boogie 212, for example.
Yes, I'd love to get a Zilla 412 as well, but shipping is quite expensive, and Brexit, not to get too political, that kind of threw a wrench in the works as well to get stuff from England.
Brexit isn't even politics; it's just a shambles, is what it is. It does. I don't think it even belongs in the general bin of politics.
So, did you know Paul from Zilla before you got that 412? Do you guys go back longer? Because you just mentioned you've been working together on some speaker shootouts.
Yeah. So actually, the connection to Zilla goes back really long way. Wow. I don't know. It must be 2008, perhaps, something like that. I went with Des Nagel, who was the guitarist in the Safety Fire, and then Good Tiger. He's a very good friend of mine, goes back a long time. He's now one of the co-owners of GGD, so one of the people I speak to most, I guess. And he lived in London at the time. He was having some custom cabs made, and he didn't drive, so he asked me if I could drive to collect the cab. So I went to the Zilla workshop when it was in London, which is going back a long, long way to pick up that cab. And then pretty soon afterwards got a Fatboy of my own and gigged with that when I was playing my old band, Red Sea's Fire. And very, very long connection with Zilla. And I think that because then I kind of recommended them to the guys in Periphery, that seemed to do a lot for the visibility of the company,
yeah,
particularly the Fatboy.
I think that's where I first saw Zilla Cab too.
Yeah. We used the ones that Paul shipped over to the States for the Juggernaut record, a couple of different ones. And again, around that period was when the Greenback range came out. And I did a shootout with Zilla a very long time ago now. Yeah, going back to kind of 2012 or something, where we did different combinations. And at the end of the day, we listened back to everything and we were like, oh, we really like that Greenback H. And then that kind of became like a combination of Vintage 30 and a Greenback H. I think Misha ended up ordering it. Mark ordered a cab with that. And then it seemed to be in a lot of places. And I don't want to take credit for something which you know, if it's not to do with that, but I feel like it spawned from there, or at least in my awareness, that's where that really popular 2x12 combination of Vintage 30 and a Greenback H kind of came from, I think. I might be wrong.
I think you might be onto something, because that's, as I said, I think that's where I remember seeing Zilla Cabs first. I think Misha had a couple of Fatboys, and I think a Hesu cab as well, a blue one, with some anime graphics on it. It's yeah, I know. Since I turned 30 a few years ago, my memory's garbage, but there was something there anyway.
That's pretty good memory if you can remember the labels on the back of the cabs and the beef roll from the neural DSP footage.
I just retain information that is absolutely useless for me for some reason.
It's very useful right now.
Well, yes, the exception to the rule. So, Greenback speakers. That brings me to another topic that a lot of people ask me. What other speakers are you into except for the Vintage 30? Are there any other favorites? I know you did the Gold Stack, I think it was called, the Greenback cabs from Getgood drums, which I like a lot as well. Greenbacks, any other things? Any non-Celestion speakers that you like?
It's tough. I mean, there's many circumstances where I can get into other speakers. But when it comes down to the actual, like, okay, we're going to do a record now and we want to make a great guitar tone, it's hard to choose to not use a Vintage 30 or perhaps a Greenback. I think, you know, a Greenback for the right kind of tone, it's very hard to beat that as well. But I think for the high gain thing, that the way that the Vintage 30's high end works, like the presence that you get without the fizz, is such a good raw material to work with, you know, the cabinet choice and the microphone type and the way you set the amp. Like, I do like the Greenbacks. And actually, when we did this recent test I was talking about with Zilla, again, the Greenback H actually came out really well. And by well, I guess I mean it actually sounded a lot like a Vintage 30. So this is the trap which I fall into, and I don't think I'm the only one, which is that the preferred speakers tend to be the ones that fall in that, like, really similar to a vintage 30, but different enough to not be in the uncanny valley where it's like, this is like a wrong vintage 30, where I feel like, for example, the warehouse, is it the WGS, the veteran
Warehouse
30
guitar speaker,
and
veteran and retro 30s.
And that Fane F70 as well. Like they're good sounding. Like I don't have a problem with them, but when you put them next to a vintage 30, it's like they say they've kind of fixed something about the vintage 30, and to me, it's like you just kind of like, I don't know. It's like seeing a picture of a face, but with the details, just like, the proportions just slightly messed with. You're just like, oh, that's not right. What's going on there?
That's a great analogy. Yes.
So anyway, to actually answer your question, I mean, if we eliminate, like if we do a record where it's like, okay, you can't use a vintage 30, then I'm going to accept a whole load of speakers with open arms. I like the Greenback H. I like the Greenbacks. I like the EVH speakers. I like Classic Lead 80. I think we spoke about over email. I think is an unsung hero. I'd love to see that getting a little bit of a boost.
I need to get one.
That and the Redback, I think, are the two best sounding large dust cap speakers, at least, that Celestion do. And frankly, I think they make the best sounding of the large dust cap speakers.
I was surprised how much I liked the Redback. I think I did a demo of that on the channel as well. Very nice speaker.
Yep. And it's got a unique voice, I think, the Redback as well. And not, So there are all sorts of speakers out there which are really good. I'll even get behind a T75 if it's not like one of the really scrapey sounding ones. And if you're going for the kinds of tone that a T75 does, but I wouldn't try and make it sound like a vintage 30, if that makes sense. Like it would need to be something that called for that tone, or a guitarist that came along and went like, I love the sound of these thrash records, and then I'd be like, okay, well, let's do a T75. So
the T75 is a speaker I need to revisit at some point, because before I discovered the vintage 30, a Marshall cab with T75s was the cab I would use at the rehearsal space, and after trying that orange cab, I never plugged into that cab again, because I always struggled to be heard in the band context at rehearsals, and I never knew why until I tried something else. You mentioned...
So the other thing I'd say, actually, along those lines is like drum tones and bass tones, and the sound of metal production now has got a lot more mid-range to it. It's a lot fatter and a lot more mid-rangey. And you run into that same problem you just described in the rehearsal room if you try and use one of those more scoop sounding speakers in a modern metal mix. Like you kind of need to make the whole thing sound a bit more old school for it to work, because that contrast of like relatively scooped guitars against quite full mid-range and the drums and bass and voice just means you don't really hear the guitar at all. It's just like and a bit of boom, but not much note. So it's kind of like, it needs to be like a period correct production almost, for it to work.
You mentioned the F70 from Fane. Have you tried any other Fane speakers?
No. Well, I've tried some like very old vintage ones, and in a situation where I had no way of really making heads or tails of what I was hearing.
If you have the chance, check out the F25, because they sent me 3 of their speakers, and the F25 is the first one I took a look at, and that, at least in the high end, is more like a vintage 30 than their F70. It has between 5 and 6 kilohertz. It reacts very closely to my year 2000 vintage 30, which coincidentally is also my favorite vintage 30, though probably just coincidence. It's not the Mesa Boogie type. It's a regular one. And I did a video on that, and that's probably coming out tomorrow. And that one was a surprise hit, because I probably wouldn't have looked at that by myself, because 25 watt speaker sounds, well, it alludes, at least to my mind, to something more greenbacky, which I like, but I'm not crazy in love with. But speaking of greenbacks again, did you go down much of the greenback rabbit hole much? Because that is something that I get requested to do sometimes, but the greenback rabbit hole, quite frankly, terrifies me, because I spent 5 years on the V30, and the greenback is much older. You have different magnet types, 2 different cone types, and then at least 3 different cone manufacturers over the years. Did you venture that far into the greenbacks? Is that something that captivates you as much as the vintage 30s?
Yeah, it doesn't captivate me to the same degree, probably because the associated tones don't capture me to the same degree. I certainly went down the rabbit hole, and I'd say to anyone that wants to hear lots of different greenbacks to check out Johan Segeborn's channel. Have you come across him?
Yeah.
Swedish guy. I think he's in Gothenburg, and certainly in his early days, a lot of his content focused around lots of old cabs and Marshalls. And he has access, or seemingly has access to just like a huge amount of very expensive speakers. Because that's the other thing, is once you get to like these vintage Marshalls and Greenbacks, like there is a price tag associated with them, which is not associated with vintage 30s from 20 years ago, you know. But I guess the thing with the Greenbacks is that it's a lot more, like the route is a lot more signposted. Like, yeah, it's a lot more is known. There are these very evident changes of manufacture of the cones. You know, you've got the Pulsonic ones, followed by the in-house R/C ones, followed by the Kurt Mullers, and they're a lot more documented. And you can find examples out there, like of Johan, for example, showing you the difference between an 8-ohm lead cone H30 versus a 16-ohm bass cone. You know what I mean? Like all of the kind of, you know, you can kind of create the matrix of possible changes, and he's done his best to kind of show you the differences between all of those.
I was only on his channel today. The man has 1,400 videos online, so it's a huge database of knowledge. Fantastic channel.
Yeah, and at one point I think it was 2 videos a week. I think he had to scale back, so I don't think anyone can maintain that. And they were quite in-depth stuff about expensive gear as well. So, and he has a job. So, or I think he has a job. I think he's some kind of automotive testing guy, which maybe resonates with you.
That would be a funny coincidence, yes.
Yeah, I think he's involved in Volvo. Anyway, that's just. I think so.
I did not know that.
With the Greenbacks, I'm simultaneously, in general, not so into them, and also a lot more accepting of the changes within them. Like, I'm into them as a whole, not very much, but I'm a lot more tolerant of the variation within them, with the exception of the kind of mid-70s and late 70s weird ones. Like, if you ever come across any of the Celestians with what they call like whizzer cones, where there's like a kind of outward horn in the middle of the speaker, or the aluminium caps and stuff like that, or the large rib designs that were really meant more for like keyboard reproduction, like you get some really harsh sounding speakers from that kind of era, if you choose badly. But
no, okay, good. I'll probably steer clear of those. Just a few weeks ago, I got a pair of G12H30 blackbacks in 15 ohms with the lead cone in a trade. Something
with the lead cone, right? Yeah,
speaker
nice.
I wouldn't really have looked at otherwise because too expensive and didn't know how it sounds. But I put those in an X pattern in my EVH cab with the EVH speakers, and I was pleasantly surprised. Supposedly they came from one of Accept's tour cabs. Guy sent me photos, looked cool. They looked like DIY cabs. They weren't branded. They had big braces, like X's in between them, and they seem to have been flight cases in themselves. They look like, speakers put into flight cases. Very cool sounding speakers.
They're very bright though, I guess is the thing. But again, one of the things which I learned from speaking to speaker engineers is that, we talk about the lead cone, the resonances of the speaker being 75 hertz or whatever, but what happens through the use of the speaker is that resonance moves down. So perhaps your lead cones in 2024 sound a lot closer to what the bass cones would have started out at the beginning of the life.
Kicked into the sweet spot, yeah.
Yeah, and likewise, those early 2000s vintage 30s probably have quite a lot lower resonance through use as well. So, and then when you go back to like the old bass cones, perhaps those have kind of fallen off the bottom of the reproduction that you can really hear, and they can quite easily kind of lose the low end altogether.
Okay.
Yeah, blackback H30s are just about as bright as I can handle, I think, especially with the lead cones, but they're certainly a cool sound.
Well, yeah, I just couldn't get rid of the gear I was selling, so I figured, why not? Try them out.
And I mean, if you hear people talking about, for example, Eddie Van Halen's famous VH1 tone, which was a blackback and a JBL, which is an even brighter speaker, like from what I understand, the actual source tone was super bright, and the engineer cut a lot of high end out of it to create the sound that everyone knows and loves. So, which just to hark back for a moment to where we started in this conversation, there is something to be said for having something which is not quite right off the bat and needing to work it with EQ or mic position to achieve a unique sound. You know, sometimes when something isn't quite right, actually it forces inventiveness, and then you get a unique output. And for example, some of my discoveries, if you want to call them that, like the things which I came across, like the glue blobs, those only really came about because I wasn't getting the sounds that I wanted, and I was going like, why not? I need to just look at this thing until I can figure out what I'm doing wrong. Why did it sound good a few weeks ago and I mic'd it up and not now? And they'd be like, wait a minute, I'm on different sides of the... It's only through the frustration sometimes that you have the discoveries. And then, you know, then you have a huge change. Like you actually get one of the vintage 30s from the right era and you're suddenly like, now the mic position is far less critical, and I wouldn't have learned that little bit of information had I not been struggling.
I'm curious, is that something you are able to hear immediately, or is that, or can you in the meantime, or do you need to work with references as well there? Because my ear definitely isn't as good, which is one of the main reasons why almost all of my videos have some sort of reference to, you know, reference whatever speaker or amp the video is focusing on against, because I need that. Most of the time when I plug in a given amp into a given cab with a given vintage 30, sounds cool to me. It's only when I, you know, reference it to something that I know sounds good, that I know has, I don't know, proven itself in a band or mixed context, that I'm really able to hear, okay, that maybe is a bit too dark, or that is kind of pokey. Is that something you don't need? Or if you don't need it in the meantime, is that a skill you acquired over time working as a producer, engineer?
I think, well, so it depends on what you're comparing. If I'm comparing mic positions on a single speaker, like if I'm trying to find the sweet spot on a speaker, I don't need a reference for that, because I'll sweep one way and sweep the other way, and I know the kind of the way that the sound changes, and I can tell when I'm in the right kind of area. But if I'm shooting out different speakers, then yeah, you need a reference, because it's like you just get what I call sonic whiplash every time, where you change and it just sounds so foreign, and then you acclimatize to it, and then you don't know where you are anymore. And you know, whether we're talking about speakers or we're talking about, you know, mixing, it's so good to have references, not to lean on excessively, but you know that if your reference is sounding weird to you, that you've lost your perspective. You know, it's really good to have it there to be like, I know from time, like over time, I know that this is a sound that I like, and I keep coming back to as one that I like. And if it suddenly sounds like, oh, it's really thin, you've definitely got way too much low end on your guitar tone. You know, that amazing bass that you're so proud of is probably way too much, you know, or yeah. So I would definitely have a reference, and I do for metal anyway. Let's again clarify that when we're talking about high gain tones, it's where all of this stuff is really most crucial, because when it comes to a clean tone, frankly, speakers become almost vanishingly difficult to tell.
They sound the same to me. Most of my speaker videos, I have one clean riff and they sound the same to me. I'm not even sure if I should leave it in, but maybe some people find it useful. I can't hear the difference most of the time between them. It
just comes down to like very global things, like, oh, this one's got a bit more chirp on it or something, and you put a high gain tone through it and it's like, it's so bright. But like, you know, with clean tones, it's like these very vague, like, oh, this one's got more bass, or this one has a bit more chirp on the top end. But you really need that high gain tone to illuminate the frequency response all at once to kind of get what's going on.
I love sonic whiplash. I took note of that. I might have to change my channel name. That's awesome.
I'm glad to. Yeah. Well, hopefully it doesn't afflict us too much in the future. Yeah. I mean,
no, it's true. Like my ear becomes so used to a certain tone that sometimes when I switch back to what I started with, which I thought sounded great, it's suddenly too dark or suddenly really harsh sounding. So my ear is amazingly relative. Absolutely not absolute.
I think if you don't have a reference, then it can take a really long time before you notice that something's gone, you know, askew. And sometimes you have the luxury of that and other times you don't. I remember early on in my relationship with Tim from Bare Knuckle, because he's someone that I've been working with from similar time with Zilla. I asked him, like, I remember the question. I was like, if somebody came in at night and took your number one guitar and put ceramic magnets in place of the Alnico ones, and you had no way of knowing, like, would you pick up that guitar the next day and be like, oh, what's happened to my guitar? And I think his response was very honest and true, which is that, like, no, but over time, you know, play it for a couple of days or take it to a gig, you might just get the feeling of, something's not quite right. This doesn't feel right. And over time, you might kind of latch on to that difference. So I think there's like the time aspect, and then I'm actually, you know, the further I go, the more experience I get, also the more I value like the very first initial reaction you have when you hear something. I think there's a lot of intuitive stuff which goes on in your brain, a lot of recognition and like an immediate kind of almost feeling reaction to something that can be very spot on actually. And then it's very difficult to hold on to that for more than a few seconds. So I think, you know, instant reactions and then time are the only other ways to do it.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. The pickup thing especially, and probably true. I remember years ago going through so many different pickup sets. One pickup set would work well to me at one guitar, and then I'd want to retrofit the others, and it wouldn't work in those. So I have a few pickup sets I like now, and I try to avoid new pickups because I want to change them all once I find a pickup that's really great sounding. So I'd yeah, your signature pickup with bare knuckle as well. That's a very popular one. One of my best friends, Simon, he uses that on one of his guitars. Very transparent and clear sounding pickup, I hear.
Yeah, so I mean, I think with pickups, I mean, let's not go down too much of a rabbit hole with them because that's a whole other equally deep and mysterious rabbit hole. But
lots of discussion going on at the moment.
Yes, I know, which is, I think as people talk about in all spheres, but, you know, there's a lot of people searching for black and white answers, and a lot of people who earn an income, frankly, by making very black and white comparisons and having very strong opinions that don't have room for grey in between. And the thing with pickups is it's such a tactile experience. Like, it is the point of transference between what you're putting into the string and what's coming out of the guitar, and it's a lot more difficult to quantify, but there definitely is stuff that's going on, and you can feel very exposed as a player with the wrong pickup, even if the tone to the listener might not have changed very much, or, you know, then don't notice any change. Like, the difference from the playing perspective can be very different, and ultimately we're trying to express ourselves through our instruments, aren't we?
Yes, it's for me it has a lot to do with the response. A lot of it has to do with feel, not so much with the sonic outcome at the end.
And I mean, but if you compare DIs, then there's huge differences. Like,
yeah.
If you change pickups and listen to them just in the clean DI or through a clean amp,
yeah,
the differences are really noticeable. It's just this kind of equalizing effect that distortion has, or in the amounts that in a high gain amp, you know, it really does equalize, but it really does make a difference to the feel. And when you get tuned into it, you start to become very sensitive to the differences. And then, frankly, once you step out of the process, I'm talking about the process of, you know, designing a pickup, you lose that certain clarity that you had, or that hyper focus that you had on the differences the pickup's making. So yeah, I definitely I guess I'll wrap up on this by saying I definitely am I want to stand up as a protector of deep learning and listening and experimenting, and not just going for really quick examples that seemingly don't show very much difference, because sometimes it takes time and experience to be able to pick out differences, and that shouldn't be overlooked.
Yeah, especially, you know, going full circle to something we talked about earlier in the recording context, where small things can sometimes add up to big effects. So my buddy Simon, who is a great fan of you, asks, well, first of all, I'm supposed to tell you he loves you. He's a big fan of your work.
Thank you. Thanks,
he writes, do you choose speakers and mic positions depending on the tuning of the song or the instruments that are playing in it? For instance, I often find very cool speaker mic combinations for heavy rock that work perfectly for drop C, or lower tunings that lack the punch in E standard. Since you mentioned before the importance of tuning the drums to the song, I feel this might be something where you have an opinion on.
Well, short answer is no, not really. I think I'm more likely to look elsewhere in the recording chain for different tunings, if we're talking about within the same genre. And then I think if you're talking about kind of different genres as the tunings are changing, then I think maybe you're tapping into, I'm tapping into, just my experience of having heard those genres and the kind of tonal differences that you might expect, kind of leading to maybe wanting to go for like a bigger, warmer kind of mic sound, or like a kind of tighter, fizzier one. And I mean, yeah, I certainly think that there are tones that fall apart when you move out of a certain tuning range, in context at least. And I think it's to do with perhaps how much the note, more than anything, is being supported of the note. How much of the note of the guitar is being supported in the final tone, because I feel like that's really the crucial thing that you're balancing when you're EQing guitar and you're choosing a speaker and a mic position, is you are trying to find the right balance of this aggressive, shushy high end, which is kind of this filtered white noise, versus the note of the guitar that you're playing, and you're trying to make sure that you have both, because both are part of this kind of beautiful combination that creates like a distorted guitar tone. And I guess certain tunings, maybe you lose note relative to the shush and it becomes unbalanced, but no, that's not really something which I look into too much. And also, for the record, when I'm tuning drums to keys, it's more than anything for repeatability and consistency through a session than trying to keep things ringing in key with the song, because I find that's a tough one to justify, other than a ringy snare drum, because something like a tom has got a pitch dive on it. Kick drum tends to not really have a defined fundamental note to it in an acoustic kick drum. So yeah, it's more about just being able to know the pitch that I tune the head to and quickly get it back into the right tuning again.
Okay, thank you. Another friend of mine, Nick Leonard, asks, favorite alternatives to the V30? We've been through that. And best mics to complement an SM57.
So my current favorite auxiliary mic with the 57 is a C414. It's not a cheap option. And I guess I'd be referring to like the older, the BULS or the EBs. There's quite a big voicing change. I don't dislike the modern ones, but those older ones have the kind of sound that I like. And I actually find that the voicing of a 414, if you get it a bit closer to the middle of the speaker, it's not that far off a dynamic, actually. It's got more extension on the top and bottom, but it's not overly fizzy. It doesn't have a kind of weird neutral mid-range that some condensers have. So I find that typically if you blend like a 57 on one speaker with a 414 pretty much in the middle of another speaker in the cab, another good sounding one, you get a really nice combination. Or on the same speaker works too. But that's kind of been my go-to. I guess if I wanted like a bigger variation, then I might look at something like a ribbon, but then the high end drops off quite a lot with like especially kind of Royer type ribbons, and I find that what I'm gaining in low end I tend to lose in interesting high end. It still works, but I don't tend to have as much of it in the mix. I guess, what mic I might use. A mic I really like actually on a cab at the moment is the Neumann KMS 105, the handheld condenser, which I use on snare drum a lot as well. That sounds really, really good. Again, that's got a dynamic kind of character to it, but with a lot of low end. So that's a really nice mic on a cab as well.
But isn't that a dynamic mic?
It's a condenser actually.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. If you take off the grill, it sounds very much like the other KM series microphones, like the KM 184 or something. But that grill instantly gives you that kind of like rolled off top end and presence hump that you expect from like a dynamic mic. Actually, it's very interesting.
I will say one of your Kali IR presets, I think it's the Great Dane. I think that was one of my favorites. That was the main reason why I looked to buy a Biodynamic M160, which is a microphone I like a lot as well. But, on guitars, not so much by itself, as a blend to just add in some sauce for the SM57.
Yeah, I'd say the 160 and the Neumann I was just referring to, which is called a condenser, those two are not that far away from each other, actually. So if you've got an M160, you might not need to get the Neumann unless you want to use it on snare, which is a very good thing to do. The 160... Yeah, I'd say certainly these days, actually, I'm getting further out of the habit of just using a 57 or using the 57 as the main part of the blend, and enjoying bringing in other microphones quite a lot into the blend. And microphones that I might have not chosen to use in the past, because I've been like, well, this just sounds like a not good version of a 57 to me in that moment. I find myself liking a lot more these days, like the M160, for example. I really like.
Any other dynamic mics next to the SM57 you like using?
Yeah, I mean, all the usual suspects, really. The SM7 can be really good if you want a darker rolled off top. SM58 is actually a really good option too. People don't talk about that too much, but that's actually got a bit more high-end roll-off.
Do you leave the grill on that, or do you take it off?
Grill on.
Okay.
Yeah. Grill on, that works really well. I mean, the 421s, I'm basically just listing dynamic mics now. But the 421s, both the originals and the 2s have their place. The 2s typically quieter in the blend, but the older 421s can sound really good just, on their own. The 441, it sounds really good on a brighter speaker, like a Greenback, for example. That's quite a thick sounding.
That longish one, isn't it? It's long and silver.
Yeah, that's a really, really nice sounding mic. Quite expensive. There's a theme, I think, with hypercardioid microphones like the B257, the M201, the M160, the 441, where I think because they have a narrower pickup pattern at the front, they actually have a kind of generally smoother sound, just by virtue of the polar pattern. Mm-hmm. So those can be really nice on brighter sounding speakers.
Cool. Nick also asks, should we be concerned about individual speaker variability with non-V30 speakers? And I would, before you answer, I'd presume so, because those are paper cones too. I would be very surprised if they weren't subject to the same tolerances and fluctuations. Have you done kind of testing shootouts with the same model of different non-Celestion speakers?
Not so much. But yeah, I mean, concerned, I guess it depends. I'd say in the scenario which I was in, where I was trying to replicate, to my mind, the greatest guitar tones, which I knew were made with a vintage 30, I really cared about the variation, because I was trying to figure out, and I didn't know what was going to be the thing that was going to carry me over the finishing line, if that makes sense. So any bit in variation seemed very important to me. In a different context where you're just trying to get a good guitar tone, then usually if you've got a decent sounding cab, then one or two of the speakers in a 412 is going to be perfectly great for recording, or be workable through mic position. One of the things I really like doing at the moment is putting like a little bit of an angle on an SM57, but not pointing it towards the middle, as people typically do, but kind of pointing it kind of tangentially around the dust cap. So angling it slightly, but not pointing the front end towards the center. And that immediately gives you like a very smooth, expensive sound from a 57. And I'm talking like 10 degrees kind of angle, that kind of thing. And that instantly makes a lot of brighter speakers which, if you just go A-Bing the full A-B-C-D-Eing, what am I saying? It's like A-B-C-D-ing, the four speakers in a cab, you might instinctively go towards like the smoothest sounding one. But if you were to go to one of the other ones and just angle the microphone a little bit, you might end up with a sound that you really like as well. So I guess my main question mark is around the use of the word concerned. I'd say that really depends on what you are trying to do.
Another question regarding speakers. One viewer asks, how valuable do you think collecting speakers is as a producer? I feel I could collect and test speakers for years and maybe never come close to some of the Neural or Getgood drum stuff.
I mean, I don't know how true that second part is, because you could very much just get a really great sounding cab right away and never have any doubts at all. Just be like, oh, my guitar tones are great. This is brilliant. Which I think happened to some of the owners of the original Mesa 2000 cabs, for example. Like, again, speaking to Andy Sneap, he was like, I never thought there was anything special about that cab. It was just the cab I had, kind of thing. But for the first part, I think it's something which it's a fun thing to do. It's less expensive than some of the other things you could be doing, especially in the studio realm. Like, you could certainly get a lot more in terms of variation of tone by getting loads of different speakers and getting different preamps, which don't really make very much difference at all to the sound, for example. But as with any creative profession, at some point you need to actually just do the damn thing. And if you spend all your time just doing shootouts of speakers, then you're probably not going to be using your time to write and record really great music, which is a trap I've certainly fallen into. So probably a healthy balance is required, right? And I mean, people like myself on my own and now publicly John are going to the trouble of making all this stuff very accessible and understandable, so that hopefully you don't have to spend that amount of time and money in your life to learn the things which we've discovered.
Another viewer would like to know how to find the serial number for a 2000-2001 Mesa cab. So is there a particular serial number range one should be looking for when looking for one of those special cabs?
So if you're looking for a Mesa Boogie 412 that comes from that 2000 to 2001 period, the first thing to say is that the serial number will start with a C, not a C2. The C2 cabs came in and they recessed the handles, the side handles, and the back plate as well. I don't think the cabinet construction changed, actually. But that's just something to be aware of. If you can see that the flat parts of the handles are protruding from the side of the cab, then it's an original C cab. If they're recessed, then it's definitely not going to have 2000 to 2001 speakers in it. And then you're looking for the serial code from C32 XXX, kind of 32,000 up to C42,000-ish. That's pretty much the date range that should take you from cabs that have January 2000 speakers up to about November 2001, which is the latest 2001s which I've come across. So there might be a little bit of overlap into the range outside there, but that's roughly speaking what you should be looking for.
The next question is from a viewer on YouTube with one of my favorite screen names for some reason. It's from It's Not Safe to Swim. And it's a question I have as well.
It's a Veil of Maya, and I think SpongeBob reference.
Oh, okay. So
if I'm not wrong, I think it was a SpongeBob thing that Veil of Maya named a song after. It's Not Safe to Swim.
Okay. I just thought it was funny. That's a funny name. So I have a stupid sense of humor. Anyway, and it's a question that I have as well. So really from what I can tell from watching the other interviews that you have, that you're a tone chaser, and it's not just speakers and microphones. It starts with the pickups, and you seem to be into amps as well. I mean, I've seen some of your posts on one of the forums we both frequent. You had a Dietzel Hagen that you modded a bit, and once again, my selective memory from that neural promo video, you're in the guts of 4 amps, I think a VH4, an 800, a 5150, and what I think was probably a Friedman. So, and you speak the lingo, you know the components, what they do. And with that in mind, It's Not Safe to Swim would like to know, I'm curious of what kind of new gear actually excites or inspires him being you, obviously. Microphones, speakers, pro audio, pedals, amps, etc. And I've wondered that as well. Are you a victim of the gear acquisition syndrome, much like myself still, or are they more tools or means to an end for you in the meantime?
I think the wanting to understand them is actually that's the anti-gear acquisition syndrome aspect of it. Because what I think you get trapped by as a consumer is when you don't understand where the differences between products have come from. And then, the next marketing campaign that says, oh, this one sounds even warmer or whatever. Like, you're like, wow, I need to have that one. And then if you know a bit about circuits, you might be, well, that's literally one capacitor value that's changed from this other thing, And once you demystify these things, I find that, in a way, it allows me to forget. How can I put this best? It's like, by really getting to understand what it is that makes something work, I can be very in peace about it and not precious about it. Whereas when you don't understand how something works, then you kind of have this almost superstition kind of tinged feeling towards this particular piece of gear, which in some way traps you and makes you kind of inflexible. And you see it happening with producers and engineers where they have to do things a certain way with specific microphones or whatever, because they don't necessarily understand what really is going on with that particular signal chain, and therefore they don't feel comfortable straying from it in even a small part. And I find that quite limiting. So I think, I don't want to say that's why I go down the rabbit hole. I think that's just my personality type, but it does have that effect of like, actually, once I understand how pickups work to some degree, I'm not saying that I have like the deepest working knowledge of it, but enough to understand the differences which I'm experiencing as a player, then I can just go back to being a player again and not have like niggling doubts in my head of like, oh, maybe I should change this or that. So I don't know if that answers the question.
I think it does.
I'd like to think that by now I'm actually finding playing guitar and writing music a lot more enjoyable than I was a few years ago. And I think that's this combined sense of peace around like the gear aspect of it kind of coming into play.
Well, that is something about this, what's a job for you, hobby for me, that I've found tremendously enjoyable over 20 years. Is always something to occupy yourself with, whether it's actually making music, what the gear was intended to, or getting into the technical details of how amplifiers work, which is something that has fascinated me as well, down to buying 60 vintage 30s and finding out which ones make the sound you want to hear. There's always something to explore and something to improve yourself on, or something to learn, really. That's what it comes down to me. I mean, I'm just enthusiastic about the whole thing.
Just trying to learn what you're doing. I mean, I think there is also, I just want to say, quite a big difference between what you're doing, which is like really wanting to explore these things as opposed to just having like a very superficial relationship to them, which you sometimes see with the people that are, I guess, most afflicted with gear acquisition syndrome, where sometimes it just feels like they don't really get into the depth of anything because they're stuck on the surface and just kind of reaching for the next new thing. And so got a lot of respect for what you're doing, which I think is much more like a traditional hobby than this kind of trying to fill the gaping hole in our soul with, yet another guitar.
Yes, it keeps me to an extent from looking at the next shiny amplifier I could buy, mostly because I can't afford it because I buy too many speakers now. But it's something I find tremendously enjoying, and I enjoy sharing a lot with other enthusiasts as well. And enthusiasm is really what it comes down to for me. Like, enthusiasm beats everything.
I think there's a real purity to what you just said that I think is why I wanted to highlight it, which is like, I think that's awesome. And it's, yeah, I hope that lots of people get to enjoy their hobbies, whatever they are, in that way, rather than in the kind of very, acquisition focused way that you sometimes see.
Well, thank you. But while on the topic of amps, another reviewer would like to know, he'd love to know what your favorite amps are and the mods you've performed.
I mean, it's a bit like with the Vintage 30, where it's like, for me, I think because of the gain structure and the subtle changes to the tone stack that you get with the 5150 compared to like the kind of modded Marshalls that came before. I mean, really, those are things which came from the SLO into the 5150. I feel like it's so appropriate for modern music. Like, it just works really well that it's hard for me to look to any other amp and think of it as better than that. Like, that's always going to be the reference point for me. But if you tell me that I need to make an amp without one, then suddenly it's like, oh, cool, yeah, let's explore all these other kind of variations out there. I think the Friedman stuff is really good. It's a B100, nearly 10 years old now, so it's not the kind of modern crop. But that's a really fantastic amp. And I think once you understand a little bit about schematics, if you look at the schematics, which might be a little bit, they're kind of pieced together by people rather than official schematics, you can see that what Dave's done actually is kind of given you like a whole menu of popular Marshall mods on your switches. So it's like once you know what's going on under the hood, it's actually amazing because you're like, oh, this does like all of these different famous modded Marshall sounds if you just know what the switches do. So I find that to be a really rewarding amp, and quite different for high gains than your EVHs. It's your EVH, by which I meant to say like 5150, but including the EVH to an extent. I do like the kind of more German voiced amps, but I find that they're more prone to that blocking distortion of like a wide open input, by which I mean like bass frequencies rushing into the high gain and kind of creating this collapse when you play the low strings, that it just kind of becomes more like a fuzz rather than staying tight. And for example, an amp like the VH4, I feel like it's one of the weirdest amps. Like if you look at like a 5150 or most modded amps, it starts very tight at the input stage, so the bass frequencies don't get into the distortion circuit, so it stays very tight. And then through the sequence of gain stages, just everything gets brought back up again through the saturation. The VH4 is the opposite of that. It starts wide open, so you get this very kind of flubby distortion, and then it gets tighter through the gain stages, so you're kind of locked into this quite flubby sound from the first few gain stages, but then it kind of feels weirdly tight. Dan Gower once described it to me as confused, And I think that's about the best description for it. But if you're not chugging, which ultimately I think is probably the equivalent of high gain to speaker choice, chugging is to amp choice. Because if there's no palm mutes, then suddenly all amps become really appropriate for high gain use. It's only really in how they cope with the kind of big blooming low frequencies of a palm mute. If you're not chugging, then something like a VH4 can be really cool because it does have this really gnarly complexity through having such a wide open input stage. There's the Gower Amps as well. Those are fantastic.
I agree with you on the VH4. It's an unusual amp. It's quite unique. I like it a lot because it's not easy to play for me. I think it's a challenging amp. It makes you work and you kind of get what you put in. I'm a big Diesel fan in general, which started because I saw those two, Peter and Peter, in interviews in German, and I just saw how enthusiastic these guys were about what they make, the amps they make. These guys, it was obvious to me that they loved what they were doing. So I really wanted to try a Diesel amp, and I started off with the Demol, which had a bit of a learning curve to me. And through circumstances, long story, I ended up getting a Habit Mark 1, which I immediately fell in love with. It's one of my favorite amps to this day, and kind of went down the Diesel rabbit hole. But the VH4 is definitely one of the more unique amps in my experience as well. So
I'd say as a producer, it's worth having just because it's such a different sound. It's one of those amps that really changes the game. It's got that really compressed thing as well. Like it's got a weird thing going on with I think it's in the phase inverter. I forget actually. The post tone stack. Anyway, there's something going on which is like, just has that mad compression kind of feel. And you really play a different way when you play through one of those versus a 5150.
Kind of a different compression than, say, an Engel amp, for example, which is much easier to play and much tighter. So,
yeah, I mean, the Engel compression is more like, it's more to do with how the gain is handled, I think. Because if you reduce a lot of bass at the beginning of the amp, something like a Marshall or Marshall's kind of derived amp, then it's how can I say this best? It's a bit like using a sidechain on a compressor and taking all the low end out of it. Suddenly the amp's only really responding to that far less consistent part of the spectrum, which is the kind of high frequency content in your tone. Whereas I think what Engel have done is that they haven't gone super tight on the input stage. So it has this quite liquidy feel, and that then kind of feels like it doesn't require you to put loads of effort into the strings for it to have some kind of carry to the distortion.
Yeah.
Whereas what's going on with the VH4 is just, I don't know how they come up with this or why, but no one else has got that particular thing going on with that compression. I mean, the other diesels don't do it either. And what I respect about the German guys is, like, between Bogner and Diesel is like their schematics and ideas are just so different to what you see from other manufacturers. Like, they're doing really wild stuff. Massively different approach to like to negative feedback, and Bogner does some really wild stuff with tone stacks, and it's fascinating. So it's like an amp geek. It's exciting because it's like this is done very differently. And Engel, of course, like very switchable and very integrated with that stuff. So in terms of modding, I just want to clarify, like when I mod amps, I'm not going to the extent of doing things like adding gain stages or massively revamping amps. It's more changing components, which is a bit like just EQing things along the way, or changing the tone stack values, which is changing the EQ points of the EQ, which can be quite powerful. So I wouldn't call myself a modder in the way of like the 80s guys that were throwing extra tubes and transformers into amps.
So more scalpel than machete.
Totally, yeah. Well, except I'm pretty rubbish, so it's definitely not clean work. It definitely looks like someone took a machete to the inside of those amps.
Well, yeah, been there, done that.
Yeah.
You mentioned Dan Gower, which is great because I've got a question about that. One viewer is curious to get some details on your Gower modded Marshall.
So I have two. Gower modded Marshalls. I have one which is his Rock Monster mod, which is very high gain, really compressed, a bit kind of verging on like a rectifier crossed with a 5150 in that it's not as tight, but it's very liquidy. And I wanted an amp. That was actually the second one I got from him. And I wanted one that just has very simple controls and that doesn't have lots of knobs and switches. The other amp, which was the first one I had modded by him, he did a variation on his like Killer Cali ++ mod, which basically puts lots of what are typically fixed value resistors and capacitors into play as adjustable pots and switches. So it kind of just opens up a Pandora's box, which if you know exactly how you want to set things and what they're doing can be fine, but otherwise it can be a bit over the top. So, well, that sounds like I'm being disparaging. I find it has less of a satisfying workflow. Like, I don't want something to be a one-trick pony, but when just everything's on the table, it's a bit overwhelming. So I asked him if he could remod that. I told him some of the favorite aspects that I have, particularly of the 5150 circuit. So the way certain values that I found really made something feel and sound the way I liked when I was messing inside amps. So he kind of just based a mod off that. So that's kind of like a 5150-ish Gower style with a few extra knobs and switches. So that's a really nice amp, actually.
Just one question about amp schematics and things like that. How did you get into modding amps yourself? Do you have a technical background, or are you completely self-taught? Like, I want this, I'm interested in how this works, I'm going to figure this out, and I'm just going to replace a capacitor here, try it out. How did that come about?
So, I mean, I did a bit of electronics in school, I guess. I was always into physics and all that kind of stuff. And we did have like electronics classes when I was, I guess, in my early teens. So I knew roughly how to read a schematic, but nothing as complicated as an amp, of course. And then, just self-taught. There's some really good resources out there online that you can learn, just kind of starting from a Fender Champ or whatever, and then working your way up. And it was just a lot of like kind of spot the difference of like, I'm looking at this really basic amp. Can I find the analog of that in this much more complicated design? I'm like, oh yeah, then you start to
looking for
easily
patterns,
be able to recognize the tones. Yeah, exactly, yeah. So, in terms of the way that most tube preamps are sorted out, I'm quite knowledgeable. But once it comes into like the actual, probably the stuff that sets apart the great amp builders is more to do with grounding management and all sorts of stuff to make the amp operate really quietly and effectively and last a long time. Is not just about choosing like the amp values. It's actually more to do with like the actual like engineering of an amplifier. And I'm rubbish with that. And I don't get the impression of that from a schematic. And there's lots of things I've just kind of ignore on a schematic because I know they're not the main things which are going to yield the differences which I'm interested in. And things like switching, for example, get super complicated as well on schematics.
Yeah, MIDI, optocoupler arrays, stuff like that.
Yeah. Or even just trying to figure out when it's not like schematics aren't designed to be read by people that for a specific amp that aren't working on them. So, there's a lot of like information which is just impossible to figure out, like positions on a switch just having numerical values, and you kind of don't really know what happens when you switch that. Is that switching this bit over to here, or you know what I mean? Like, you can just get a bit of a nightmare.
I relate.
Yeah.
I have one last question pertaining to amplifiers. One viewer would like to know, what do you think of the Laney VH100R?
Yeah, I like, well, I mean, I've never owned one of those, but I had the GH50 and the GH100, and I think those are really nice amps. I got those because of Paul Gilbert using them around the Racer X Superheroes album time, and I love the tone on that record. I think it sounds amazing. It's a really nice lead amp. And one of my biggest tone heroes, Andy Timmons, played the VH100R, I think, for a while, which is odd because it is fairly bright. But what I find with those amps is you need to set them a specific way.
Yep.
Like the boost needs to be on for the high gain sound, and dial in the tone stack a specific way, and then they sound really good. My impression is at the time they came out, people, master volumes were nowhere near as good as they are now. And those are amps that need a bit of volume to sound good. So I think they got written off by a lot of people because for bedroom playing, they really just didn't work at all. But actually nowadays, everyone's got load boxes and attenuators that sound really good.
Yeah.
And you can kind of come back to enjoying those amps. I've always thought those amps should have more of they should be more valued, I think, than they are, because they really are like a cool modded Marshall sound that are very appropriate for the kinds of tones that people like.
I have a few questions from viewers that focus on recording and production. Somebody would like to know what speakers and IRs you use for that bass tone. Oops. I'm not sure what that bass tone is, but you might know what that bass tone is referring to.
I'm going to assume that he's referring to like kind of my bass tone, I guess. Like the kind of periphery bass tone. Yeah, so that's, for a long time, that's been a blend not the same blend or IRs, but it's typically the blend of like an Ampeg 810, kind of very scoopy and kind of slightly gnarly top end, with a big low end blended with something like a 4x12 with vintage 30s. Not 50-50. It's probably about 70% Ampeg, 30% kind of guitar cab vibe. The guitar cab thing being because I do have quite a lot of distortion on my bass tone, I find that having a bit of that, the exact qualities we're talking about, the vintage 30s, having that kind of smooth distortion character works well on bass as well, although they don't tend to have as good big low end as the kind of 8x10 captures do. So that blend for me just works really well to keep it sounding like a bass, but at the same time having an appropriate top end for distortion. And I'd like to think also that it puts the guitars and the bass into a slightly more similar world tonally as well. So
is that more cohesive than in the mix, or does it make your life as a producer easier?
I think, well, for what I'm going for, yeah. I mean, there's so many ways to have the bass represent itself in the mix audibly. It can be something that's quite a different but complementary tone to the guitars. It can be something which is more just about supporting the fundamental. But the thing which I've gone for with Periphery and carried into a lot of my productions is this kind of overlap with the guitar that you end up with like a kind of almost octaver effect on certain bits. So for that kind of aesthetic, which I go for with Periphery, at least, I find that it's useful to have that bit of similarity in the distortion character, for sure.
Another viewer asks, I wonder what he thinks about recording mic'd up bass cabs. So.
Yeah, I don't find it to be super useful, to be honest, because the low end is never... Like, I typically want to get the low end from the DI because it's going to be a lot more consistent. Like, the notes are going to be a lot more consistent. I have no problem with doing it. If I was on a session where we were going to record a whole band and we had, I don't mean necessarily playing simultaneously, but all instruments, and we had the time to do so, for sure. Yeah, let's set up a rig. Let's capture something unique for this sound. But typically, I'm not miking up cabs for bass. I don't feel like it has the same benefit that it might do on guitar.
Extremely Joey would like to know, what part of the mix do you not compress?
None of it.
Fantastic.
I mean, well, no, guitars typically. I don't compress rhythm guitars. I might do a little bit of multiband compression, so I guess technically nothing escapes that. And then everything's going through the compression on the more mastery side of things. So, but yeah, I mean, as a rule, like the more dynamic something is, like a drum, if it's got these huge peaks and then very quiet information in between relative to your distorted guitars, which are just square sausages of waveforms, you tend to need a little bit of something to kind of even the playing field a little bit. Otherwise, there's no way you're going to get the quiet information on those dynamic tracks to be audible through this just block of audio, which are electric guitars. So inevitably compression and saturation needs to come into play.
Another viewer says, or writes, this isn't a gear nerd question, but I'd love to know how he, Nolly, you, applies compression on fast blast beats. What compressor type and attack release would he use?
Well, I don't use different settings to the rest of my drum mix, but I might automate the volumes around. Like in a blast beat, what tends to happen is you can, well, it can go one of two ways depending on how aggressive the player is on the snare and the kick when they're blasting. Some players, the kick drum becomes really dominant, and other players, the snare drum becomes very dominant, and the tone of the snare drum changes a lot. Because when you hit something, anything, on an acoustic guitar or a snare drum, softer, and then you equalize the volume out with the harder hit, it suddenly sounds a lot bassier on the softer hit, if that makes sense. The whole frequency range is kind of gets brighter the harder you hit something. So on a blast beat, if they're hitting the snare quite softly, you go, okay, let's make that louder, but now the snare sounds just like boom, 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 like someone almost hitting a tom, instead of sounding like a snare drum anymore. So you might need to kind of work on the EQ or something. But I don't change the compression for those sections. I'd say if there's generally very fast music, I might use a faster release time on my compressors, maybe. But kind of that's more likely the other way, actually. If something's very slow, I might use a slower release time so that things feel a bit pumpier and gluier and heavier. But yeah, it's not something I think about in that specific way.
On the topic of drums, another viewer would like to know why you use coated head kicks instead of clear head.
I don't always. I like both. So yeah, it's just, different sounds for different things. I think with drums, something to play with. It's similar also to miking up guitar cabs. Like, Do you want to capture a sound that's smoother but darker and then needs some brightening up later, but arguably has less harshness inherent in the sound? Or do you want to capture a brighter sound at the source and, maybe then have to notch out a few overbearing frequencies? Both are valid. Inevitably, some post work is required in both situations, and it's kind of part of the fun of doing it is to just kind of take a different approach on each session, and kind of see where you end up. So yeah, sometimes coated head, sometimes clear.
Primal Nerd asks, how much lower mids do you scoop out of V30 recordings for a metal mix? Now, as far as you've said before, it seems like you were looking for that vintage 30 where you wouldn't have to do much to it. Do you do much scooping out of lower mids when recording V30s?
I try not to. Again, though, I'll say that for me, the variation that I ended up looking for really was mostly in that 1K and up area. The low mid stuff is way more to do with the cab and the miking. So yeah, these days, to be honest, I do more boosting than I do cutting on guitars, which is kind of a big change for me as a mixing engineer. And by boosting not low mids and everything else, you kind of have the effect of scooping relatively the low mids. I guess if I was just doing cutting EQs, typically I'd expect my cuts anywhere in the spectrum to be in the range of 2 to 4 dB maybe. And then I'd be adjusting Q value to make sure I'm not getting rid of information that's important, towards the edge of those cuts if I'm going more extreme.
Lucas Lecomte Music writes, please ask Nolly if he taught Misha how to djent.
I definitely did not teach Misha how to djent. I can assure you it was the other way around.
I think there's only a few viewer questions left.
Just to talk about that point, in the early days, I remember, when Jake joined and Mark joined and Alex Boyce as well, like Misha showed those guys how to djent. That was part of if you're going to play guitar in periphery, you need to know how to do this palm mute thing the right way. So, teaching people to djent was definitely a thing back in the day. And that is a correct usage of the word djent, by the way.
My friend Baritone Goat Studio asks, have you ever considered...
Baritone Goat?
Baritone
Sorry,
Goat.
I don't know if I'm just getting nice.
No, Baritone Goat Studio. He's a friend of mine. He has a cool YouTube channel as well, very technology focused as well, or the way things work. He would like to know if you've ever considered approaching a brand to design a custom or signature speaker. Based on an earlier answer, probably not, because it's the vintage 30, right?
Yeah, I mean, for my liking, yeah, it would basically the situation that could occur would be Celestion saying "Hey, would you be down for R&Ding some new speaker cones to hopefully replicate the sound of those early 2000 speakers?" And I don't feel like that would necessitate a signature product. I'd feel very weird and wrong having that be my signature product, but I'd happily help them along the way. But as we've discussed on and off camera, I think these modern vintage 30s occasionally do seem to swing into pleasantly dark and smooth territory as well. So with tolerance allowances as well. So who knows?
I had one comment recently where somebody kind of speculated that those 1-2 batches of smoother sounding V30s that I had might have had to do with supply chain issues during COVID, which is plausible. That is, I could imagine a scenario where that could be maybe different source for the cellulose. I don't know, or maybe different.
Maybe.
Yeah, it seemed possible, let's say.
Maybe, yeah. To be honest, what I think happened is that someone at Celestion told some influencers that one particular batch that had gone out onto the market, there was a large quantity of darker speakers in the more recent batches that went out, and so they pointed that out, and it was just kind of one of those tolerance things again, where they're like, oh, the current batches are pretty dark if you want to grab one, and then they swing back the other way, and then they swing dark again. Who knows? Yeah,
it's interesting. Maybe I need to buy a new one to see where they are now, because from what I could see, they seem to have gone back to the way they've been since 2007, 2008, in later 2020. But I haven't had a V30 newer than that here. I kind of try not
I
to
feel like
buy any
that's the whole
V30s
new
anymore.
level, though, right? That's basically, yeah. I don't have an interest in becoming basically like, yeah, like consistency manager for the Vintage 30 production in Celestian. I'm very set with my speakers now. Frankly, I need to get rid of them, and I'm happy to have found the ones that I have found, and also happy to try new ones. But I'm not in the hunt in the way that I was. Pretty much once I found those like 2000 and 2001s, I was like, that's it. That's the thing I was looking for. Woohoo! Let's take a break.
Off the top of your head, do you know how many speakers you have?
No, straight up no. There's a whole load at my parents' house actually, which I forgot. I went into my old bedroom, which is just another kind of essentially storage facility for touring gear and stuff. And the whole ground is almost covered in individual speakers, all driver down. So I don't know, a lot. And there's still quite a few that are still in boxes, like as in were posted to me, and I never got round to installing in a cab, and it's just I don't even know what's in the boxes anymore, kind of thing. So yeah, it was a full-on few years, but I've kind of moved on from it now, and I don't have the facility for miking up cabs in the house that we live in now. Whereas when I did a lot of this in the house where you'd have seen the promo for the neural stuff done, I was able to make a racket during COVID, and was just doing that constantly, basically. So my priorities have shifted a little bit.
That leads me to one question I have, and that is, how do you balance your different roles? I mean, you're an accomplished producer, an engineer, you're a musician yourself, and an entrepreneur with Getgood drums, various signature products with different brands. Do you have a typical regular workday, or how do you approach these things? Is it kind of project based from, I'm going to work on this project for a few months, and then I'm going to work on this project for the next few months? Or do you have certain days of the week that are Getgood drum days, and those days are engineering days, production days? What does a day in the life of Nolly Getgood look like?
Well, I mean, for better or worse, the answer to do I have like a schedule or a typical day is no. All of these projects tend to follow similar trajectories, although over different spans of time, of like intense creativity towards the start, maybe some intense testing sessions, and then also kind of spread out testing over time. I feel hugely just lucky. I mean, I have a really amazing thing in my life, which is that I'm not kind of tethered to specific jobs. I get to work with the clients as a producer or mixer that I want to, which is not very many these days, not because I don't want to work with them, but because I'm busy. I've got a young child and got lots of other things in my life, but I feel like I'm getting to kind of revitalize by kind of going around all these different projects and then kind of coming back around to GGD or to working with a client or to working on a pickup. And I definitely have a lot on my plate, probably more on my plate than I can realistically handle, but nice opportunities come up, and I'm getting better at explaining how involved I might be able to be during certain times in the process. So it's a learning process for me. I think it's on the better side. I'm free to kind of follow caprices and kind of get really deep into something new and chase that and turn it into a product, which is hugely lucky. And then on the worst side of it, life can be quite unpredictable in terms of work, and if I don't have a exciting project in any of those spheres, then it can feel a bit like, what am I doing here? I just kind of potter into my studio and I don't even really know what I'm doing. So yeah, brutally honest, no kind of schedule, which is great sometimes and then overwhelming at others.
Yeah, I was about to say, it sounds very invigorating on one side, and on some days probably quite overwhelming.
Yeah, and I think with time and experience, I've learned how much of a similarity there is between the trajectories of each project that you get involved in, and that's allowed me to be a lot more at peace with the whole thing. For example, when I was really getting into understanding amplifiers, it was all consuming, and I didn't want to do anything apart from that. And I had other responsibilities, and I was like, oh, what's going to happen? Am I ever going to get round to my other responsibilities? Am I going to become some kind of amp geek exclusively? And it's, through the process of going through that multiple times, going to come back to like, yes, these things, the winds change, you get really obsessed, you get something out of it, and then you can move on to the next thing. So yeah, it's a very blessed situation to be in. Sometimes I wish that there was more stability and just normalcy, but I really, really can't complain.
Great, thank you. I have one last viewer question, and that is my friend Ian would like to know, what was the first amazing mix or record that inspired you to become a connoisseur of tone?
Well, I mean, the first, there's probably something which I'm not aware of. I think there was probably something formed over time. I mean, I remember hearing Chuck Berry and stuff in my very early years when we still lived in Singapore, so before I was 6, where something about the distortion of the guitar and the kind of rock and roll sound really stood out to me. And undoubtedly that was part of the creation of this interest and kind of taste that led me down to, heavy music. But I guess it was probably around the time that I started playing guitar, my early teens. So nu metal was kind of a thing. And I loved the guitar tones on things like Linkin Park. I loved the guitar tone on Lit. Had a really good guitar tone. Actually, that Lit, A Place in the Sun record was pretty much the reason I started playing guitar, seeing some other kids playing riffs from that in school. There was stuff like Sum 41, but I always liked the guitar tones that had a bit more gain and carry to them. And I think like the big power chords that you found in things like Linkin Park and Papa Roach and the kind of nu metal bands that had those tones were really influential on me. And then later, as I got deeper into guitar, I guess I heard stuff that was more like Metallica and Megadeth, and I think all of that stuff together kind of formed that starting point. And then I think probably the first time I was aware of an Andy Sneap production was probably like Trivium or Killswitch Engage, kind of 2005-ish. And I wasn't into screaming vocals really. I found that quite off-putting, but I remember thinking it just sounded so powerful and mean, like the guitar tones on Trivium especially. I remember just was like, didn't really want to hear the vocals, but I really wanted to hear the guitar, so I kind of persevered through it, and that became very formative to me. And that, of course, is one of the records that Andy used his Mesa Boogie cab on, so it's unsurprising that kind of stayed imprinted.
What I found particularly engaging when that type of music emerged in the early 2000s was just the dynamics of the whole thing. Like they took those pieces of nu metal and melodic death metal, the Swedish sound, and they just combined that and had these amazingly dynamic sounding songs to me, where they had really aggressive choruses that just sounded ugly and disgusting, and then it would just kind of bloom into this amazing melodious chorus with fantastic harmonies. That's really what got me hooked on that music back in the day.
Yeah, I think that's a huge key to Metallica's success, really. I think
yeah.
Metallica, probably more than any other band, influenced bands like Trivium so much with the kind of neoclassical and chromatic riffing, and then these kind of neoclassical, clean, almost folky things.
Yeah, classical guitar intros, battery and stuff like that. Yeah.
Yeah, totally.
Remember the first time I heard that one too. That was, yeah, you're right. You're onto something there.
Well, I remember my teacher, I wanted to learn a Papa Roach riff. I forget which one. And he was like, this is kind of a Metallica thing, just kind of done fresh. And he put on something, I don't remember the specifics. I think he put something off like Kill 'Em All or something. And he basically showed me where the riffing style had come from. And that really changed the course for me, where I was suddenly like, I get it. This is kind of like a simplified version of thrash metal, basically, And that was really hugely influential. But I do remember, Hybrid Theory and stuff, those really big combination of power chords with an octave melody line kind of becoming this one fused kind of big wide chord on a distorted guitar. I feel like that was something that stuck with me to this day. Like when I write, I'll often have power chords and then an octave on top, and they'll be close voiced enough that it will sound almost like one really big guitar, and that's hugely influential for me.
I just remembered, I think one thing for me was I don't think I don't know if it still exists, but there was a magazine in Germany, guitar magazine, and they had playthroughs of certain songs on a CD with it, usually MIDI sounds. And it must have been 2005-ish or something. They had Bullet Ride from In Flames on it, and just even listening to that re-recording they did for that, or I don't know if it was MIDI or if somebody re-recorded that, just the dynamics of that thing just blew me away. I'd never heard anything like it. I was like, what is this? I need to look into that. I just remembered that.
Yeah. I think, obviously younger people, speaking as an old person, might not remember, but like we were so limited by the CDs you could afford to buy, basically. Like you didn't have an infinite selection of CDs. And I feel like the trajectories that we went on in terms of what we got into is so defined by like the CD that we chose to spend for me, like kind of £10 on.
Yeah.
Like I didn't get the Tool record, I got the Deftones record, and that was hugely influential for me. Whereas I know other people got the Tool record, or I chose to get Rust in Peace instead of Master of Puppets, so I became like way more into Megadeth. And it was that kind of like, financial selection aspect that was quite limiting, but I feel like
that's true.
Yeah,
you didn't
really kind of form those things. So the point being, I never got an In Flames record until much later. I didn't have that experience with In Flames.
That's true. I didn't really consider that the landscape was a lot different back then when I started learning guitar, when you presumably started guitar also in your early teens, so maybe a bit older. I think you're probably a few years older than I.
I'm 37, so
well, I'm 35, so about the same. Yeah. I don't think we got the internet till I was 15. So when I started guitar, a friend had a CD with all these tabs on them, and the Power Tab software. That was amazing. Like tab software.
Game changing. Power Tab, yeah.
Before that, I was trying to learn sheet music. I was
doing Ultimate Guitar, but that was just like people, just writing it out in HTML kind of thing, and with very wildly varying degrees of accuracy.
Yes. Oh yes.
Yeah.
Or just tabs in editor, not even in a tab software, just ASCII code tabs.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. And printing them out on paper so I could, ring off the dial-up connection and go and learn the songs. Mm-hmm. Those are the days.
Yep.
We're old, aren't we? Wow.
Yep. Times have changed. But also to the better. I mean, it's cool that there's so much more information. Our information is so accessible now these days, and we can figure this stuff out. We can share it with other people, like which vintage 30s sound a certain way.
Yeah.
I have one more nerdy question that I'd love to hear your take on.
Sure.
Recently, somebody commented on a video that had the Fane F70 in it. And the way I do it, I have my vintage 30 in the Marshall cab and whatever speaker I'm demoing in the other. And I think this guy commented, he said that for the F70, really all the speakers in the cab should be F70s for the F70 to sound as good as it can to its full potential. And that got me thinking about impedance curves. Every speaker has a slightly different impedance curve. It's not static. I mean, it's rated at 8 ohm. That's a DC reading, but that's just the rating it has at a certain frequency. So different speakers will have different peaks and valleys when it comes to impedance curves as well. They flatten off different. And I was wondering if you perhaps have done the test or have a theoretical consideration on that. Say, if I have a 4x12 cab that has 3 vintage 30s in there, and I put a Jensen or a Fane speaker in there, will the fact that the amp sees an impedance curve that is put together out of 3 vintage 30s and one different speaker make the amp react differently and therefore affect the frequency response of that non-V30 speaker? And I asked this, I sent Ignacio from Jensen a voice message. That's my little flex, that this hobby is giving me access to all these people who really know what they're doing, yourself included. And it was the first time I asked him anything he didn't have an immediate answer for. He was going to ask his engineers. I always messaged him for some reason at the worst times. He was in his vacation and took time to answer me anyway. So I said, okay, sorry, I won't bother you anymore. But I really wanted to ask you this. Do you have any experience or any guess as to if that has an effect or how large that effect could be?
I think the latter question is the important one. Like, undoubtedly, it has some electronic effect, right? You know, that there is going to be some change.
Mm.
How noticeable it's going to be, I'm going to say it's going to be negligible.
I think so too.
I've definitely compared, you know, two speakers in a cab, and then changed one of them without moving the mic on the other, and the difference is really small. Like, I can see it on a graph, maybe, but we're talking such a tiny amount. I mean, obviously, if you put a speaker in out of phase, then that's changing the dynamics inside the cab a lot, and that's a huge difference. But and I have had a situation where someone accidentally put an 8-ohm speaker into a 412 that had three. We were doing impulses, and they just wanted to change one speaker in the cab, and unknowingly, to me, they'd actually put an 8-ohm in with an otherwise set of 16s, and that did have a difference. So you could see that the mid-range looked different. I think because of the amount of power being distributed around the speakers being different, causing the baffle to flex in a different way. But and you know, the internal reflections to be a bit different. But I think unless you're talking about a difference that big, we're going to be talking about really small changes. I would certainly push back on the idea that you haven't heard the F70 properly until you've put it in a cab.
I don't think so either.
I'd say you definitely have.
Yeah. I'm going to do the test because I want to know. I agree with you. I think the effect, I don't think it's, I don't expect any huge differences, but I'm going to try to see if I can find some speakers with as different impedance curves as I can, and then do a few tests, like put one maybe in a 1x12 and the other speaker in an ISO cab, so that I can really isolate them, because there's several effects that could come into play, none of them probably with a huge influence in a closed mic situation where you have the other speaker bleeding in a bit, slightly, maybe the internal resonances of the cab could be slightly affected, and then the last one I thought of was the impedance curves, perhaps. But yeah, I don't expect any life-changing results either way. I was just curious to get your take on that.
Yeah, I mean, especially again, I don't think you're going to find that there's much difference in the really audible part of the spectrum. You know, the tiniest differences in like the 1K and up are hugely obvious through high gain. You know, they're like different voices on human beings. Like, they've got very noticeable signature sounds, whereas the differences lower down tend to be wider, more global changes, and feel less important unless you're talking about a radical reduction or increase in the amount of bass frequencies. So yeah, I definitely think it's a test worth doing, but I don't think you're missing out on anything currently.
Yeah, that is my prognosis as well. That's the result I expect. Maybe tiny differences, but nothing that would alter the voice of a speaker in a way that it really matters in any context other than scientific accuracy.
And I mean, the impedance relationship is so complicated. You know, it's such a rabbit hole, just that topic alone. Yeah. There is stuff changing with the impedance all the time based on other variables. So yeah, that's one of a tiny. That's one tiny part of a huge spectrum of things that can be going on with that impedance relationship. So, yeah,
I'll be able to keep myself busy on this topic for a while. That's for sure.
Well, I look forward to seeing the results of it.
Eventually, let's see. I have the good problem that I have more ideas than time to film them at the moment. So see where it goes. But that's definitely a test I want to do, and look into some of the effects that cabinets have and cabinet construction have on sound. That's something I want to do next, because
yeah, a lot subtler than speakers when you're talking about small variations in cabinets, but they do make a difference. And when you look into it and you listen to lots of enclosures, it's kind of easy to see why the enclosures that are most popular are the most popular ones, because they just do have the kind of most pleasing effect on the sound of the speakers, basically. But yeah, it's fascinating. It's a whole huge world. I'd love to dive into it more myself. You know, obviously with my contact with Paul, it's something which potentially could be something that we do in the future. But you kind of need to have access to someone that can actually make cabs, I think, to really get the most juice out of that particular topic.
That's all the viewer questions I have. That's all my questions answered. Thank you so much for your time, Nolly. It was a pleasure. I really enjoyed this. Yeah, thank you very much.
Yeah, it's a pleasure for me too. It's really nice to be able to kind of talk to people that are similarly interested in these kinds of things, and the fact that this is filmed and going to go out to an audience of people that seem to enjoy learning more about this stuff as well just makes it all worthwhile. So I'm really glad we did it, and yeah, I look forward to seeing what you get up to next.
Me too.
Do stay in touch, mate.
Yes, definitely. Thank you very much. Have a good night.